We're very honored to have David Lorimer, who is a writer, lecturer, poet, and editor, founder of the Character Education Scotland, program director of the Scientific and Medical Network. And David's background, he's originally a merchant banker, then a teacher of philosophy and modern languages at Winchester College. He is the author and editor of over a dozen books, most recently, A Quest for Wisdom. David is also chair of the Galileo Commission, which seeks to expand the evidence base of science of consciousness beyond a materialistic worldview. David, thank you so much for speaking to our organization today.
Thank you very much, Robert and Yvonne, and it's a delight to be here this evening with you all from North Holland, where the sun is still up, as I'm sure you can see, but the lighting will slightly change over the hour, but I have that in hand, so you can be reassured. So I'm now going to share my screen, and we'll get straight into the presentation, which is Gnosis in a Future Science of Consciousness. The reason I've got this photograph, I've got one at the beginning and one at the end, is that my spiritual lineage is with the Bulgarian movement founded by Peter Dönhoff, who was a great sage and musician. And I had this wonderful walk on the 2nd of August, 2017, on my own in the high mountains in the Rila area. And you can see in this photo, this extraordinary beam of light coming down onto the very pure lake. I met one person all day and maybe a couple of horses. So these wild places are very valuable, and we don't have enough of them. So I'm going to go through a number of slides and talk a bit about my theme, and I think you'll understand why I feel it's important as we go through these slides. So this first slide concerns a book called Catafalque by Peter Kingsley, which is subtitled Jung and the End of Humanity. And I would like to highlight a number of his points. He, in his many books, he talks about the origins of philosophy being in the sacred, in mysticism, in initiation, and in gnosis. And he's done a lot of work on the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers Parmenides and Empedocles, particularly Parmenides, who he feels is more important than Plato, even though most philosophy departments think that Plato is more important than Parmenides. And he says in this extraordinary book, which half of it is a book and the other half is references, volume 2 is references, and sometimes you've got 20 footnotes, 20 references for one footnote. Philosophy, logic, science, even the apparent arts of reason all have their origin in the experience of another world. This is crucially important in our time, because our materialistic science denies the existence of worlds other than the material. And he continues, there's no true philosophy which does not reach completion in a metaphysic of ecstasy, no mystical experience which does not demand serious philosophical preparation. And such precisely was the dawning of wisdom. And this is related also to the French philosopher Henri Corbin, who wrote a lot about the imaginal, not the imaginary, but the imaginal world. And the great philosopher of religion and mystic, Syed Hossein Nasr, who is 86 this year. He was professor of Islamic studies at the George Washington University. He says that real deep knowledge is associated with bliss and union, not with separation and objectivity. And so from a prophetic point of view, the duty of Kingsley is, as he writes, to shock people into an awareness that all life comes from and returns to the sacred. This is the Alpha and Omega. And this is a shocking statement in a materialistic culture which denies even the existence, let alone the significance of the sacred. And I feel this primacy of the sacred is also the message of indigenous people. And I recently reviewed the wonderful book Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. This is also what the indigenous peoples tell us. Now, this is my own understanding of life in a very broad frame here. The Gnostic game is the fall and the remembering in the Gnostic game. So on the left, you have the conditions in which we find ourselves. On the right, you have the aspirations that we are moving towards. So you have separation, density, and polarity in the physical world. And we're moving towards unity and wholeness. You've got a process of emanation or unfolding or explication from the one, and then a return or a refolding or a return to the implicate on the other side. And this phrase, unfolding and refolding, comes from Walter Russell, who I'll say a little bit about further on. But the whole of nature, in fact, is this unfolding and refolding process. And in the Northern Hemisphere, we are in this unfolding process at the moment with all the leaves and flowers coming out. And in the autumn, everything refolds into the earth. We are on the periphery, but we are related to the center. Plotinus said that our condition is one of forgetfulness and ignorance. He said, remembering is for those who have forgotten. So remembering is a Platonic process, and we have to remember who we are and why we're here. And this in Greek is aletheia. Lethe is forgetfulness. And so aletheia is remembering and overcoming forgetfulness. And this is a process of ignorance towards wisdom. Another metaphor that's used, or other metaphors, are sleep and awakening. We're asleep and we need to awaken. We're in darkness and we're seeking the light. We have descended and we need to ascend. This is the idea of the fall and the ascent. We are in a situation of being led that needs to be changed into gold. This is the alchemical process. And we are the small self concerned with our own affairs, and we need to move to this universality of self. And this is a process that begins with unconscious unity, but moves towards conscious oneness. So this is simply my scheme that I'm proposing, which I think is a progressive awakening to our true divine nature. And this slide is about the Gnostics and their three levels of identity. And so the first level is the Hylics, coming from Hyli, which means matter in Greek. And these are people who identify with the body and who philosophically are physicalists. So most people identify themselves with the body rather than with something beyond the body. Then the next level is the Psychics, nothing to do with the meaning of psychic these days, but the people who are aware of psyche, which is the soul. And this corresponds symbolically to water and to pistis, which is the Greek for faith. So faith, not gnosis, faith, pistis, which is belief. And these people see themselves as part of the whole, and it corresponds to the soul. So this is how I understood things 20 or 30 years ago when I was writing my first books. But I've now moved to position 3, which is the pneumatics. Pneuma is the spirit, always related to breath etymologically. And this is gnosis, where you know that you are the whole. You know that your consciousness is the divine consciousness, is the universal mind, is the spirit. And so you have these 3 levels of body, soul, and spirit. And gnosis, and this is the argument of the Galileo Commission report, gives us access to deeper structures of reality. So the materialists think that everything is on the surface in the brain. But our universal human experience teaches us that there are deeper structures of reality which we ourselves are capable of accessing because of the very fact of our humanness and the nature of our consciousness. And this is a quote from a book by April de Koninck, who's the professor of religion at Rice University. Our essential human self or spirit is nothing less than God's own, very own life essence. waiting to be awakened through gnosis. And the point that she makes, which is very, very important, and there are 4 different phases of this, and we're in the 4th at the moment, is that gnosis is always transgressive, which means that it transgresses the boundaries and understanding of conventional wisdom of the day, and it's countercultural. And so we in the Scientific and Medical Network and in the various movements, we are part of a countercultural, beyond the mainstream understanding. And I regard ourselves as being in the creative minority, the cultural creatives, trying to bring in a new and truly universal and sustainable culture, which involves being in harmony with each other and with nature. Now I'm going to go into Jung's Red Book. Some of you may have this extraordinary book, which was published about 10 years ago. And it's his journal of his descent into the soul with some absolutely extraordinary paintings. If you didn't know Jung was a painter, you need to look at this book. And a lot of it is written in exquisite manuscript style with fountain pen and black ink. And the reason I put Bill Plotkin in, this is a recent book by Bill Plotkin called Soul Initiation, is that he also talks about the descent into the unconscious and the importance of this in the human journey. And he has a number of very interesting chapters on Jung's Red Book. So what Jung does, he contrasts the spirit of this time, which is also the spirit of our time, this is the material spirit, with the spirit of the depths. The first would like to hear of use and value, but that other spirit forces me nevertheless to speak beyond justification, use, and meaning. So this is the profound spirit that he encounters, which is our essential spirit. And he explains that this encounter with the spirit of the depths took away his belief in science, forcing him down to the last and simplest things, and places understanding and knowledge, quote, at the service of the inexplicable and the paradoxical, the melting together of sense and nonsense, which produces the supreme meaning. Note that phrase, which produces the supreme meaning. And so the supreme meaning is not to be arrived at by reason alone, but rather also by bringing in intuition and imagination. And he points out, and this is true 100 years later, the spirit of the time is blind to what really matters, preferring to live on the surface rather than plumbing the depths, seeking out what is rational, reasonable, and therefore comfortable and respectable. And it's a great temptation for us to seek out this rational and reasonable and be comfortable and respectable. But if we're going to make progress in the world, we need to be uncomfortable and not so respectable, as I will be arguing. This slide is about the spirit and the letter, or the spirit and the law. And I regard this as an essential insight into the development of spiritual movements, that they are always prophetic and experiential. The founder has profound experiences which he or she shares with immediate followers and disciples. And they then put this into a system which then becomes dogmatic and often divinizes the founder. And so these people in touch with the spirit are mystics, they're Gnostics, they're prophetics, they're heretics. A heretic means literally someone who chooses, high-rhyme in Greek. And we still have this alive and well, especially in the last couple of years with COVID, this witchcraft, witch hunting, demonization, marginalization, people losing their jobs for retaining their integrity. And in the area of the psychic, the defense is always that, well, this is woo-woo. And woo-woo is a completely meaningless term, which is used rhetorically by skeptics to dismiss the importance of evidence that they know nothing about, but which they think cannot exist in principle. So then we should be aiming at gnosis, or knowing. And here's Kingsley again. The existence of a transcendental reality is indeed self-evident, that the world inside and outside rests on a transcendental background is as certain as our own existence. And this is a scandalous kind of statement for someone coming from an entirely materialistic view. But it's his deep experience, and it's the experience and statement of all the great spiritual teachers and mystics. They would say that for them, the existence of a transcendental reality is self-evident. The problem is that gnosis or experience or insight is translated into institutional dogma. And there's a story about the senior and junior devil from C.S. Lewis, where Christianity is just starting up. And the junior devil says, this is very worrying development. We've got a new and powerful religion that could undermine our work. And the senior devil says, don't worry, we'll help them organize it. And that's always been the problem. As soon as you organize, institutionalize, and systematize the prophetic spirit, you turn it into the letter, into the law, and then it becomes a matter of obedience and compliance rather than being in touch with our innermost spirit. And so he says the spirit and fire of Christ had to vanish, be stamped out. So the birth of the church is a second crucifixion and death. What an extraordinary analysis. And after that, the only way the spirit of Christ could stay alive was inside the heart of a few hidden heretics and mystics. And these people are always persecuted, such as the Cathars and the Bogomils in Bulgaria in the medieval period. I live in the Cathar area of France. And then the Jung Institute, this is a good story which illustrates exactly the point, that Jung set up the Jung Institute as an interdisciplinary institute for the study of anthropology, psychology, philosophy, comparative religion, and so on. And so it was to be a interdisciplinary study center, rather continuing the work of the Eranos meetings of the 1930s, which were held at Eranos on one of the great Swiss lakes. And so the people who were in charge of the Jungian Institute told Jung that Jung didn't understand what the Jung Institute was about, which is training Jungians. And so the Jungians told Jung that he was wrong when his original vision had been contradicted. So there you are. So the spirit of prophecy, and I'm speaking prophetically tonight with a sense of urgency, is related to spiritual emergency. And this is a very interesting point. So he says, this is Jung, the primordially ancient is something new, and that our task is to give birth to the old in a new time, the perennial. In other words, to translate the essential spiritual insights of humanity into language and an understanding for our contemporary people. Kingsley feels that without prophets taking us back to the primordial reality of what we are, who we are basically, not upgraded machines, we have no future left. And Attenborough says something very similar from an ecological point of view. And so I feel this is where we are as a culture. And these are my words. We're cut off from our ancestors, cut off from our roots, cut off from our center, cut off from the sacred, cut off from our deepest identity. And we urgently need to return to this source, as Viktor Frankl found in his Auschwitz experience, that love and the spiritual was the essence of life. And so this process of rebirth is one that takes us beyond the personal into the impersonal, transpersonal, or universal. So we no longer live for ourselves and become a source of life for others. This is Kingsley, these are Kingsley's words. But I very much resonate with this because at 70 that I've just passed, I feel that the meaning of my life is what I can do in terms of service to other people and becoming a source of life for others. St. Paul famously said, Christ in me, not I, but Christ in me. So if we can realize our universality and express that in our everyday life, then we have really become the unique expression of life which we potentially are. I'm a great fan of the French philosopher Simone Weil, 1909 to 1943. And she wrote an extraordinarily penetrating essay on human personality, where the impersonal, and I would say the transpersonal, she wrote this in 1943 before transpersonal existed, is the realm of the sacred, which is also the realm of truth and beauty, into which we can all tap truth, goodness, and beauty, the Platonic triangle. And in a letter to Déodat Rocher, which I've seen the original of in France in the museum devoted to Déodat Rocher, who was a neo-Cathar, she said that modern philosophy and science provide us with, these are her words, une nourriture spirituelle insuffisante, which translated into English means an inadequate spiritual nourishment. And I profoundly agree with this, because I think what's being offered up by our educational systems is not food for the soul, food for the spirit. It's just insufficient. Now I want to devote this slide to a few thoughts from Jung's book, Aion, which is about the phenomenology of the self, because I think it's important in terms of understanding where we are. So Jung writes that the God image is immediately related to our identifier with the self. And everything that happens to the God image has an effect on the latter, i.e. on the self. So any uncertainty about the God image causes a profound uneasiness in the self, which destroys the continuity of historical tradition, which is the hallmark of civilization. So this is what's happened, that the modern thought has destroyed the God image and the notion of the universal mind, the microcosm and the macrocosm. So we don't know who we are and where we're going. And he then says that the consequence of this is the destruction of the God image is followed by the annulment of the human personality. And with all the mental health issues that we're facing at the moment, you can understand what he's saying. And he reinforced this in his 1958 essay called The Undiscovered Self, where he said the individual is the carrier of values. The individual is the carrier of values. And this is where we've gone wrong, again, in the last couple of years, that the individuals who have been maintained their integrity have been ignored. And as carriers of value, we've been told that responsibility is no more than compliance and obedience to diktats from the state. And this is a very dangerous situation, morally and spiritually. You may know these lines from William Butler Yeats's Second Coming: things fall apart, the center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. This is his poem, The Second Coming. And here's T.S. Eliot coming in, again written in the 1930s, early 1940s. The first quote is one from his four quartets. This process of spiritual development is a condition of complete simplicity, costing not less than everything. And until you've experienced this, you won't know the truth of these words. But the simplicity involves a stripping away of everything that you think you are in terms of ego. And in Chorus to the Rock, he writes, where is the life we have lost in living? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? Quite extraordinary that you should write this in the 1930s. And he also wrote in the four quartets that we are distracted from distraction by distraction. And if he'd seen the screen-based culture that we're in now, he would have seen his worst forecast coming true. So coming back to Kingsley, and at my stage of life, I understand this shedding process. It's only by shedding everything, including ourselves, that we sow the seeds of the future. The seed has to die before it can germinate. And that applies to us in terms of our transformation, our spiritual transformation. And what it involves is listening to our dreams and listening and tuning into the synchronicities in our lives. Now, this is about ways of knowing, this slide, and it comes from St. Bonaventure talking about the three eyes, which you might translate into the three lenses. And again, this I think is an important kind of model. The deepest and highest eye is the eye of contemplation, which would traditionally be called the intellect. From intellect is literally to read between, and it's the higher function which enables us to understand our oneness in gnosis, in non-duality. And it's the nous in Greek, the nous. And it's non-dual. In other words, you experience the larger reality as yourself and yourself as the larger reality. Then you have the eye of reason in mathematics and logic, and this is called dianoia, which is to know through. And finally, the eye of sense. And what you can see is in modern science, we have a highly developed eye of reason and eye of sense, but the eye of contemplation is missing. And it's the highest and deepest eye. And this is a serious matter, that the highest and deepest faculties are missing. And so the church, this is my argument, philosophy and psychology and science, they downgrade the inner knowing and gnosis, which was in St. Clement of Alexandria, he explains that gnosis is the experiential understanding of pistis, of faith, but actually knowing it directly. So as I've just been saying, modern science looks only through these lenses of sense and reason, and is dominated by the left hemisphere, as Ian McGilchrist argues in his masterly new volumes, The Matter with Things, which I highly recommend to you. And even if you think you'll never get through 1,400 pages, you actually will, but you must take your time, because the book is the most important philosophy book in relation to science and neuroscience to be published in the last 100 years. And what happens is that the observer, the knower, the subject, the consciousness, who we are, is excluded from the picture. And so we've suffered what Kingsley calls a metaphysical amputation, with the suppression of gnosis in favor of pistis and belief, and now unbelief. So here's Schrödinger and Max Planck. This quote from Schrödinger comes from an essay that he wrote called Nature and Greeks, which I highly recommend. Schrödinger was the Nobel Prize winner, Schrödinger's cat, you're familiar with in physics. I cut out my mind when I construct the real world around me. And I'm not aware of this cutting out. This is the problem. Then I'm very astonished that the scientific picture of the real world around me is very deficient. It gives us a lot of factual information, puts all of our experiences into a magnificently consistent order, but is ghastly silent about all and sundry that's really near to our heart and really matters to us. It cannot tell us a word about red and blue, qualia in other words, bitter and sweet, physical pain and physical delight. It knows nothing of beautiful and ugly, good or bad, God and eternity. And what's so interesting about this essay is that he traces this cutting out of the mind and the observer right back to the Greeks, and shows its lineage right through the history of science. And this is from 1931. It's part of a very famous quotation by Max Planck, also a Nobel physicist. I regard consciousness as fundamental. Matter is derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness, and this is the really important point to absorb. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. And so you really have to arrive at a theory of everything, which means that consciousness is important as the other physical forces. Then we might have a theory of everything. So we need to bring consciousness into the center. So there are two ways of looking at this. There's consciousness within science and science within consciousness. So broadly speaking, the third person perspective is the objective perspective of most of modern science, which says the brain produces the mind, matter is primary. We know about that there are neural correlates to consciousness, which we can analyze in the brain. It's quantitative, and it believes, this view, this third person perspective, believes that the brain produces or generates consciousness. Then you have a first person perspective, of mind being primary over matter, and a science of qualities or qualia, leading to a view espoused by William James and more recently by Ian Gilchrist and Aldous Huxley and Henri Bergson and F.C.S. Schiller, who you won't have heard of, which is that the brain is somehow a filter. It focuses us on physical reality, but it filters out a lot of essential information. And what's so interesting is that the mystical experience, and obviously the NDE, a fortiori, is associated with a reduction of brain function rather than an increase. And so you can see the logic here that maybe the brain is a transducer of consciousness rather than the producer of consciousness, which is what is assumed by 99% of philosophers, psychologists, and neuroscientists. So what you see happening in the wider cultural landscape, if you like, is the emergence of serious studies of mysticism, William James's Varieties of Religious Experience, Mysticism by Evelyn Underhill, 1911, the work of the biologist Alistair Hardy on religious experience, the coming forth in the 70s of near-death experiences, the work in parapsychology, Maslow's humanistic psychology, the transpersonal psychology movement, the more recent movement of science and non-duality. And then spiritually, you have the findings, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nag Hammadi Gospels, and particularly the Gnostic Gospels, which show Jesus not as the Lamb of God hung on the cross for our redemption, but rather as a wisdom teacher along with Mary Magdalene. I have a quite different lecture on Mary Magdalene and her relationship with Jesus, which is absolutely central to our spiritual renaissance in our time. And what I argue is that all the evidence we have from near-death experiences and mystical experiences, such as Yvonne herself recounts, is a form of gnosis, and it's a form of initiation into the deeper structure of reality, where we see that what is primal, is light and love. So instead of going for information, we get transformation. We get metanoia, which is the Greek for conversion or transformation. And then we know ourselves in a deep sense. And this was the Delphic oracle, which said, know thyself. So here are some examples of near-death experiences as gnosis. I just found myself in this extremely bright light and felt absolute peace. I feel the light and the peace are one. I had no sense of separate identity. I was in the light and one with it. Another one. I came into the ark of pure golden love and light. Notice the two things together. This radiation of love entered me. Instantly, I was part of it, and it was part of me. In other words, I was it, and it was me. As I became one with this omnipresent light, its knowledge became my knowledge. And you'll see this with Walter Russell in a moment. And in relation to these experiences in general, the philosopher of religion, Jeff Kripal, I'm going to talk a little bit about his work in a moment, he says there are three bars in relation to such experiences. The first is, do they happen at all? And there's general agreement about the fact that they do. The second is, are they significant for mind and consciousness? An increasing number of people feel they are, including myself. And the third bar is, do they have implications to the nature of reality? I profoundly believe they do. And that if we don't take these experiences and their implications into account, we're not going to understand life and reality at all. Here's Walter Russell, and very few of you will have heard of Walter Russell because his writings are very much on the sideline, unfortunately. So here he is with his sculpture of Mark Twain. Quite extraordinary sculpture, I think you'll agree. He only started sculpting in his 50s. And the first person he was asked to sculpt was Edison. And so he had to call on all his divine connections and sense of genius in order to be able to turned himself from a painter, he was also a musician, an architect, artist, and turned himself from a painter into a sculptor. And there's more vividness, I think, in this image than in most sculptures you can think of. So here's some quotes again along these lines. So Walter Russell wrote this extraordinary book, The Universal One, in 1928, which I've read about half of. It's an extraordinary book and incredibly dense. He sent it to several hundred people, didn't have a single reply. So he says, all knowledge exists in the mind universe of light, which is God. This is his own experience. All mind is one mind. We do not have separate minds. That's what we're beginning to understand, and which New Thought understood over 100 years ago, as I'll show. All knowledge can be obtained from the universal source of all knowledge by becoming one with that source. This is gnosis. Cosmic consciousness is the goal of human development, whereby we as individuals become aware of our oneness with the universal mind and can manifest genius, which he did. So in terms of the evolution of consciousness, I entirely agree with this, that cosmic consciousness is the goal of human development. And this is what we urgently need to develop now in order to develop a corresponding ethic of interconnectedness, realizing that we are one another, and then to solve our world issues from that viewpoint, rather than from the viewpoint of power and domination and wealth and money. Huxley, from The Perennial Philosophy, 1945, knowledge is a function of being. When there is a change in the being of the knower, there's a corresponding change in the nature and amount of knowing. And so this, again, is a very important statement, because, again, if you're looking from the sensory point of view, you get one kind of knowledge. From the point of view of the eye of reason, logic, get another kind of knowledge. And then with the eye of contemplation, which corresponds to McGilchrist's right hemisphere, you get a more profound intuitive understanding. Then Eckhart, writing in the 14th century, said, the eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. That's an extraordinary statement, which you need to live with in order to understand it profoundly. But what it means for me is a reciprocal, non-dual knowing. And the very nature of consciousness, if you think about it, it literally means to know with, conscio. And so consciousness is what enables us to know anything. Without consciousness, we cannot know. And the profoundest knowing is this knowing that we are one with that very same universal consciousness or divine mind. So here's another example from New Thought, Master Key System 1916 by Charles Harnell. There's one principle or consciousness pervading the entire universe. As this consciousness is omnipresent, it must be present within every individual. Each individual must be a manifestation of that omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent consciousness. Your consciousness is therefore identical with the universal consciousness. All mind is one mind. Notice that it's the same statement. Schrödinger said the same thing, and Heisenberg also. Your consciousness is therefore identical with the universal consciousness. All mind is one mind. Each individual is the individualization of the universal cosmic mind. And another philosopher, who's a slide of whom I don't have here, is Thomas Troward. But he expresses the same universal thought. But he adds that we all experience ourselves as centers of consciousness. And he says that what can say I am in me is also what can say is the same as what can say I am in you. So when God is defined in the Old Testament and also in Gospel of John as identity with the I am principle, this is really what we're talking about here. Here's another parallel with Chris Bache from his recent book, LSD and the Cosmic Mind. And you'll see that this is the same insight. I knew myself to be this single encompassing consciousness. I knew that its identity was my true identity, a non-dual identity. How consciousness manifests itself in separate forms while remaining unified. But we've forgotten that it's unified. And that's why I was saying earlier on that the cosmic game is to remember that we are the one consciousness, we share the one consciousness, that we are one another. Then in another passage, he says, as I expanded into what I was seeing, I was becoming larger. I learned by becoming what I was knowing. So this is knowing, direct knowing. I discovered the universe not by knowing it from the outside, which is the third person scientific perspective, but by tuning to that level of my being where I was that thing. And here's a very David Bohm kind of expression, a seamless, undivided, totally unified organic whole, a vast creative intelligence, the mind of the universe. So what we need to understand in science, in philosophy, in psychology, is the nature of this vast creative intelligence, the mind of the universe in which we participate and whose creative impulse is ours. So he concludes, I retain an unshakable an unshakable epistemological certainty that this knowing was of a higher order than my ordinary consciousness. Every mystic says this, that the mystical experience, the gnosis experience, is one that is of a higher or deeper order. Now we're going to go off into history of religion here, just to give another angle on the whole topic. And so you've got Jesus and the Lost Goddess by Tim Freke and Peter Gandy. It's quite an old book, but I read it recently. And what they point out is that there's a parallel between fundamentalism in religion and literalism in science. And so the letter or materialism in science is equivalent to a form of fundamentalism where you persecute those who don't agree with you. And gnosis and science in their pure forms, they're both about knowing, posit freedom to question. And this is of the essence of science, which has been again forgotten in the last 2 years, where we're told the science is settled, you cannot question the science, and that's the consensus view. Science is never settled. There are always different views and different interpretations. And interestingly, both the words Gnostic and scientist means knower. And so I feel that the Gnostic is one who is a seeker after truth. We have a quest for truth, an understanding of inner space, and knowledge of the self with the capital S. But this, as Renee Weber pointed out in her interviews with scientists in the 1980s, dialogues with scientists and sages, that there's a common quest for truth and understanding and insight and wisdom in both science and spirituality. And so they write, realized Gnostics know that the knower and the known are one. This is what I've been talking about all along. They are the mystery of God manifesting as all that is. There is no self and other, no subject and object. All is one. With the realization of gnosis, we find ourselves no longer separate from others, or indeed from anything, but at one with the mystery, with all that is. We dissolve into mystical communion. We are in love with all beings because love is this cosmic unifying principle. So a little bit more on gnosis in history of spirituality. This is from Giovanni Filaramo, who is an Italian Gnostic scholar. Gnostic knowledge is a lived experience of spiritual regeneration, knowledge of the beginning and of the end. To know means to become the same reality that is known, removing the dichotomy between subject and object. This is what I've been saying for the last half an hour or so. So importantly, the emphasis is on experience, not on doctrine, i.e. it's on knowing experientially and immediately. And the countercultural transgressive aspect in relation to authority that I referred to with April de Koning earlier is that gnosis provides justification for not obeying priests and bishops, which is why they were excommunicated as heretics. Elaine Pagels, in her famous Gnostic Gospels, 1979, she says gnosis is self-knowledge and knowledge of the self, capital S. Very beautiful expression. And it's really the essence of insight. And so you could summarize this by saying that to know oneself at the deepest level is simultaneously to know God. And here is a quote directly from April de Koninck. So this is about incubation in silence, which is a practice of the Gnostics. So this represents both the primal state of the ineffable God they seek, i.e. silence, and the bodily practice in which they engage to withdraw into this primal state as they return to the source of life. So this is the meditative state, the original state. The primal God in Gnostic myths is a silent God, and the goal of the Gnostic journey is to withdraw back into this original silence, rest, and stillness. Silence is considered the state of utter transcendence, the very essence of ultimate reality in its original condition. And living silence, she says, is a state of silent light. Astonishingly, and I mentioned this in my review of this book, she doesn't equate this with meditation, when it's exactly a good description of meditation, the original silence, the rest, and the stillness. And so I think this incubation idea was, in fact, an early form of Western meditation. Now I'm going to come to some comments on Jeff Kripal's work, The Flip, his book, The Flip, and also the two volumes, and there's a third one that has just appeared, Irreducible Mind and Beyond Physicalism, from Ed Kelly, University of Virginia, and the Esalen Institute. So what Jeff says is that science is half right. So the third person perspective is half the truth, but it's not the whole truth. And the flip, those scientists and academics who have this experience, and we've got a book coming out with 50 plus experiences, including Yvonne in the book, is from an outside to an inside perspective, from the objective to the subjective, from the third to the first person. When you understand consciousness from the inside, not by looking at the brain through a microscope. So Jeff talks a lot about impossible experiences. And so that all the experiences that happen, which are the bread and butter of parapsychological and parapsychological work in the laboratory and psychical research, these are just anecdotes or coincidences. And mainstream materialism will say, well, these things are impossible. And you get journal refutations of Etzel Cardenas, the American psychologist, article 2018, which are philosophically on the basis that these things can't happen. But that's absolutely illogical, because things that happen, happen. You can't say they don't happen. You might disagree about how you might explain them. And so he paradoxically says these things that happen all the time cannot happen at all. And that's clearly nonsense from a philosophical point of view. You can't understand reality by denying that people have the experiences that they say they have. And the encounter, this flip, has to be personal and beyond linear thought, language, and belief. It's a form of gnosis, in other words. And the crucial thing is an experience, not an experiment. And he says, and I think this is quite right, the mind is the locus of all scientific practice and knowledge, which is what Planck was saying when you can't get behind consciousness. So here you have the structure of logic so far as the materialistic approach is concerned. And he says very tellingly, this is Jeff Kripal, our conclusions are really a function of our exclusions. And what is dismissed is therefore missed. And so you can't understand something by dismissing it. What you're trying to do there is just maintain your own philosophical position in spite of the evidence. And that, in that sense, he writes, the materialism rigorously leaves out everything it cannot explain. And I think this is so true. And he says that in academia, there is a dominance of the production model, by which I mean the brain produces consciousness, and a suppression of the transmission model, whereby the brain might be a transducer or filter of consciousness, which makes a lot more sense of the whole range of evidence, as William James realized in 1898. And the problem is that this order of knowledge, this materialistic orthodoxy, is disciplined and policed. So it's political, and it has career and research reprisals, as we've also seen with COVID. So any doctor or scientist who doesn't agree with the mainstream narrative has been threatened with dismissal. Peter McCullough is a good example, lost his professorships, lost his editorships, in spite of writing 600 peer-reviewed papers and the most comprehensive analysis and papers on early treatment of COVID. He was simply removed and deplatformed and just demonized, and resulted in this witch hunt. And similarly, reactions to Daryl Bem and Thomas Nagel were equally vitriolic as a heresy of challenging a materialist worldview and challenging power and authority. And what McCullough and others have done in the last 2 years is challenge the authority of the pharmaceutical industry, which has been driving this narrative. So he concludes, if mind is not in the radio, the impossible becomes possible, indeed predictable. And this is the shift that we need. And I probably is preaching to the converted here, or preaching to the choir, that you all think this is a plausible position. And in terms of humanities, this is his area, Kripal's area. He says that the humanities you could define as the study of consciousness within culture, interior and exterior expressions of quantum states in the deep strata of reality. And people like Jung and Kingsley and Jeremy Nadler, they realized this, that the nature of culture and the interior aspect, and the idea espoused by Bernardo Kastrup and Rick Tarnas that we are the universe becoming self-aware. And so the problem is that unique experiences are not amenable to the scientific method. They're amenable to a legal approach, but not the scientific method. And therefore, they conclude anything beyond must be unreal, unimportant, even fraudulent. And this is what is called by Jeff a misstep. And so what we're really talking about, what we're moving towards, is a conscious cosmos, where the reality of meaning is sparked between the objective events and subjective states. Symbols appear between, representing a both and rather than an either or. And we're moving towards something more balanced and integrated, again, in terms of Ian McGilchrist's The Matter with Things is analysis of the complementarity of left and right hemispheres of reason and intuition and imagination. So dreams and reality live on this spectrum, an imaginative or imaginal spectrum. And if we tune into this, then we realize we live in a resonant world, and synchronicities can happen all the time. And so in this conscious cosmos, the inner, outer, subject, object are not sharply distinguished, especially in gnosis, which is knowledge by identity. And you find this in Goethe as well, with his science of qualities and contemplation, that you understand something by becoming one with it, which is also what Barbara McClintock did with her research on maze. And so we are in a very pivotal and critical condition as a culture here, where we have a great depth of crisis and evolutionary challenge, spiritual, ecological, social, political, and economic. We have resistance, we have pressure and tension, we have a situation of breakdown, which has to lead to a breakthrough unless it's going to be completely chaotic. And there's a widespread feeling of despair and powerlessness and loss of hope, and a sense that if we aren't going to transform with a radical system change, we're on the verge of its extinction. And a lot of people are writing about this. I read a lot of books with similar analysis. So we need in this community to tune into this fundamental spiritual impulse that we're here for spiritual awakening. And we need to work out how we can seed this in a major way. And the basis of it is this realization of the oneness of life and consciousness, that we are one another, leading towards a planetary ethic of care and interconnectedness, bringing heart and head together, and taking love seriously as a principle, as an organizing principle. And so if we look ahead, and I'm coming to an end, I realize I've got another 3 minutes here. There are basically two visions that we're being offered. The right-hand one is the spiritual one, and the left-hand one is the material one, the military one, the World Economic Forum view, based on force, violence, war, coercion. Human's just a machine. We're going to turn into transhuman, merging of machine and mind, machine and human. It's based on manipulation, on separation, control, surveillance, compliance, and it's a realistic realism in a political sense, cynicism, and I think it's going to lead to an inhuman technological dystopia. And if we don't stop it, this is what's going to be happening. So we have to form a resistance to this with an alternative vision. And it's based on centralization and globalization. Gandhi's view and the spiritual view is one, not of force, but one of power, of non-violence, of peace. Human is an evolving spiritual being, of the importance of love, connection, and communion, freedom, responsibility, integrity, inspiration, idealism, the fact that we can improve, which is meliorism, a human utopia, and what Christians have aspired to, the kingdom of God. And in my view, this is a decentralized, localized view. It's not centralized and controlled. It's decentralized and self-organizing at a human scale. And this takes us into the vision of Barbara Marx Hubbard of Homo Universalis. We're evolving in the recurring evolutionary direction as individuals towards greater consciousness, freedom, and loving order. The inner motivation of most evolving humans is towards expanded consciousness, greater freedom, and deeper access to complex order, connecting, and love. This says it all, in my view. And the World Economic Forum view is the opposite of this. It's control, surveillance, everything plugged into the internet. And the mind is a machine, and the human has no dignity at all. There's no role for the heart. And you can see here, the universal human is one who's connected through the heart of the whole of life, attuned to the deepest intelligence of nature, and shifted identity from the separate egoic to a deeper self and service. So to become a universal human is to evolve consciously, choosing a path of development that's never been mapped before in a world that has never existed before. This exactly is our challenge. And this is my most recent book, Quest for Wisdom, Inspiring Purpose on the Path of Life. I will be doing a course, which is in the process of being put together at the moment. And here we return to the Urdini Lakes in Bulgaria. Look at those lakes, the purity of the air, the ruggedness of the mountains, and the solitude of being there. And these are the websites to follow up on. I'll send the PDF of the slides through GalileoCommission.org to join that. Our Scientific Medical Network, which I'm the program director, the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Sciences, OpenSciences.org, which is related, Institute of Noetic Sciences, noetic.org, BeyondTheBrain.org, 4th or 6th November this year. That's our premier conference on consciousness, and Yvonne will be speaking at it. And that's the end of my slides, end of my presentation. So thank you very much for your attention.
David, that was awesome. In America, we would say you hit it out of the park. You did a great job. I just wanted to tell you that. And we've had a few questions, which I'm going to go to the chat area. And one of the things that keeps coming up is about how can people get this talk again, can see this. And all the talks we have are available. And it'll take a few days on spiritualawakeningsinternational.org on the video section. And they will also include the screen sharing that shows the slides. There were quite a few comments wanting to know how they could get a hold of those slides. I know I was taking pictures on my cell phone as they were coming up. So I saw a few other people doing that too. But I have to ask you, because I wrote the first question and there were a couple other questions after. Your comment about Mary Magdalene piqued my interest. And I even went to YouTube. I saw you had a talk on experiencing the divine.
Ah, yes.
Is there some information on your perception on
that's a film which is made by Anthony Cheney, Chene. It's on YouTube. And I took part in another of his films more recently with other people, many of whom are my friends, on something called Ascension. And that's on Gaia.net. But yes, that's quite a wide-ranging interview, which is from my writer's hut in the southwest of France. And yes, so what's happened in spiritual studies, if you like, and theology more generally, is that since the discovery of the Gospel of Mary and some of the Gnostic Gospels of the Nag Hammadi in 1945, so Gospel of Philip, Gospel of Thomas, Secret Sayings of Jesus, there's various others as well, the Pistis Sophia. But more recently, what has caught my attention is something called the Gospel of the Beloved Companion. So you need to make a note of that, the Gospel of the Beloved Companion, which came out in 2010. And underneath it, it says the complete Gospel of Mary Magdalene. And it appears, this is my view, and I've written 40 pages of commentary on it, that the Gospel of the Beloved Companion is an earlier version of the Gospel of John. And that John, what was referring to Mary, was then turned into John in the Gospel of John. Various things were added and elaborated and exaggerated in the Gospel of John, such as the raising of Lazarus. And of course, Mary Magdalene has a bit part and eventually was characterized by the Catholic Church as a prostitute. If you look at these Gospel of Philip and particularly Gospel of a Companion, it's very clear that Mary Magdalene was the consort, was the koinonia, the companion of, and also an initiate of Jesus. And after he died, it was her who brought the disciples together to try and give them courage. And she is asked by Peter to tell the disciples something that they don't know, nor do they understand, at which point she relates her ascension experience through the cosmic tree, which is one of the most extraordinary pieces of any sacred text. And I just vividly remember the time I was having a coffee in Lisbon and I read it for the first time. And you realize that this message, this Gnostic message of knowing the way, was hijacked, and Peter was put into the central position rather than Mary. The feminine, the divine feminine, was marginalized and demonized, and we've lived 2,000 years of the consequences of this, and particularly, and this is the interesting connection historically, is that the Gospel of the Beloved Companion comes out of a direct lineage going back to the Cathar tradition. And the Cathars were heretics in southwest France who were eliminated by Pope Innocent III and the Albigensian Crusade. And they set up the Inquisition in 1231 to deal with the Cathars. But the Cathars were trying to live the simplicity of the gospel and the principles of love. But this didn't make them very popular. And there's all sorts of more details, but I do retreats on this in the southwest of France. The current one in October is full, I'm afraid. But if anybody's interested in coming in 2023, we will be doing something similar.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for taking a few moments to talk about that. A couple other questions. For participants and David Lorimer, what do you feel are some of the paradigm concepts that shift in altered state experiences?
Well, I think you'll find that a lot of people's, that's why I said at the end that the important thing is a crucial experience, not a crucial experiment. Because you'll get skeptics saying that if only you could produce cast iron proof, then I'd believe it, I'd change my mind. That never happens, almost never happens. The reason people change their minds, so they have a profound experience which shakes their whole worldview, as I've been suggesting, and which is also in Jeff Kripal's work. And so I think it's experience, deep experience, that brings about the biggest shifts. But if you were to try and characterize this more philosophically or psychologically, then I think you'd say that if you follow the Ian McGilchrist language, you'd say that we need to rebalance the right and left hemispheres. We've got things seriously out of balance in our culture. And one of the great problems, as Ian points out, is the left hemisphere doesn't know its limitations. It thinks it knows everything. But in fact, it's missing the depth dimension. But I think, as I said in my talk, that I think consciousness needs to be recognized as fundamental, if not primary, certainly fundamental. And that will give us a more complete understanding of how reality actually works.
Thank you. Another question. What understandings do you wish would make it into mainstream knowledge?
Well, I suppose it partly depends on what you mean by mainstream knowledge. But within mainstream science, I think Jeff Kripal's book is a very good analysis, not just in the humanities, because what's missing in science is this depth dimension, this qualitative dimension. As Schrödinger said, you cut out the knower. And the other thing that's missing, which I didn't really emphasize in this particular talk, is a knowledge of philosophy which makes you realize that everything starts from an assumption. So if you ask a question, and let me give you an example from the hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness is formulated, how does the brain produce consciousness? And that's pretty standard neuroscientific question. But maybe it's the wrong question, because the answer it's looking for presupposes that the brain does produce consciousness. What if it doesn't? What if the question you should be asking is, what is the relationship between consciousness and the brain? And that's exactly what William James asked in 1898. He said there were three different ways of looking at it. There was the productive generative view, which is the standard view even now. And then there was the view that it might be a transmitter, the brain might transmit consciousness. And then there was the view, which is the Ian McGilchrist view, that it permits a certain range of consciousness, but it's not the originator of consciousness. And so for me, this question of the relationship between the brain and consciousness and the presuppositions brought to science and philosophy and psychology is absolutely critical, which is why we in the Galileo Commission argue for what we call a self-reflexive interdisciplinary science of consciousness. By self-reflexive, we ask ourselves, who is doing the knowing? Who is the self that is it doing the investigation, conducting the investigation? So that's being aware of where you're coming from and what your presuppositions and philosophical assumptions are. And interdisciplinary, because we cannot get a complete understanding of consciousness just from one discipline. And that's, I think, the direction of travel which we're trying to go in.
Suzanne Taylor put a comment, put Lukoff and Lorimer together, and you have a primary spiritual education. That's what SAI's done. You guys are back to back. So let's see. Let me get another one for you. I think we got time for one more. A lot of wonderful comments. Is the question as much about listening and yet the phenomenal way of knowing?
Listening, did you say?
Yes.
Yes. One of the things we do need to acquire as a skill as individuals is deep listening. In the 19th century, there was a journal writer called Jules Renard, and he said conversation is like a game of secateurs, where each time somebody's voice it produces a shoot, and we get ready to cut it off with what we're going to say next. And the whole principle of the Burmean dialogue is the deep listening to what people are saying and where they're coming from, and then have a period of silence before you jump in with your answer. So I think that gives a sense of spaciousness to conversations and dialogue, which is more creative than the kind of cut and thrust of debate.
David, you just did a remarkable job. Thank you so much. I personally really enjoyed it, and we hope to see you again someday. Just
okay.
Wonderful.
Thanks so much, everybody. And I will send my PowerPoint through, and maybe also my commentary on the Gospel of Beloved Companion for those who are interested. And that would enable you to understand why that's so important. But just get the book. It's on Amazon. If you're interested in Mary Magdalene, you've got to read the Gospel of Beloved Companion.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.